All right, a little bit of a technical snag to start with, but Oh, okay, no problem. I understand now. It seems as though I think I'm okay. I think I'm on the air. Anyway, the Ochelli Effect. Hopefully the bumper's done playing because I can't hear it. But hey, things happen. Live radio. Good evening. 28th day of March, 2015. And tonight I'm going to have on Joan Mellen. Okay. Oofa. Hopefully you guys can hear me. Little delay, so let me know in the chat room if you guys can hear me well, because I can't keep two things on at once over here. So, anyway. Okay, you guys will hear this all in a minute. As I was saying, Joan Mellen will be on tonight, and I definitely have some questions and things for her that have already been advanced to me by listeners ahead of time, so I'm going to try and get to those. We're going to talk about a great deal of her work. Some of it, of course, has to do with JFK, and I know that's, a subject that some of you like to listen to this show about, and some of you are tired of me talking about it, but we're not going to talk exclusively about JFK because she's working on another book, actually, right now about the USS Liberty. And as I said on Facebook earlier today, if I was to choose a biographer, if I was significant enough to require a biographer, okay, I would absolutely pick Joan Mellen first. She's actually an amazing writer, of course, Temple University professor, and the author of more than 20 different books on a great many different subjects. And the Skype doesn't cooperate. On a great many different subjects, as I said before. Maybe. Okay, that was an odd noise in my headphones. This is going to be one of those nights, isn't it? Oh, all right, let's try again. Let's see now. I don't know if you guys are hearing that crackling noise. Gotta love it. Well, anyway, among the 20 books that she has written, the ones that caught my interest most of all, in reverse order, I suppose, is Our Man in Haiti, which focuses quite a bit on George de Mohrenschilds. And there's an interesting character for you in history in a whole lot of different ways. Let's try one more time to grab Joan. Of course, the great game in Cuba, having to do a lot with those Cuban exiles that everybody talks about. Wait a second now. Here we go. This is what the problem is. There we go. Hopefully that will work. We'll see in a moment. Oh, yeah, as I said, the great game in Cuba, Our Man in Haiti, having to do with George de Mohrenschilds, of course, 2 different volumes on Jim Garrison, and a whole lot more, actually, even a biography on Bobby Knight. Non-sports fans, you might not realize he was a basketball coach, somebody of interest, and as I was trying to say and trying to time at the same exact moment, and for some reason the Skype didn't cooperate with me, I was stating that I had put out on Facebook earlier, and a lot of people agreed with me and thought it was hysterical, when I said that if I ever required a biographer, if I ever became significant enough to require a biographer, Joan Mellen is absolutely my top choice, because I know very certainly that she would give people the truth about who I was, whether you like it or not. Anyway, Joan, how are you tonight?
Hi, Chuck. Here I am.
There we go. See, I'll tell you, we've had all sorts of little electronic glitches today. You and I even lost each other earlier today on a landline.
We're good now, though, aren't we? We're good.
Oh, yeah, you sound great. I'm me, so here we are. But you sound great. And I was just talking about, the wide variety of stuff that you've written about. And I really want to make sure that we get that in, because, I've already got a list of questions from people that knew you were going to be on the show tonight. Please ask her this, please ask her that. And I'm sure I'm going to get more as we begin to discuss things. But I want to make sure that people understand that, that you're actually a prolific writer, actually, on a great many different subjects. But most noticeably to me, you're an absolutely excellent biographer. And somebody who actually takes the written record that you produce for people very, very seriously. And so I want to make sure that we get into that a little bit and kind of give people a flavor about some of the other things, not necessarily related to the JFK universe, which is where my head is often stuck, but all over the place. All sort of diverse subjects, actually, you've covered, right?
My first biography was of a writer named Kay Boyle, whom I thought was so interesting because she was in Paris in the 1920s. She was in Austria in the 30s. She returned to Europe after the war and was in occupied Germany until her husband was accused of disloyalty under the McCarthyist banners. And then she went to San Francisco in the 1960s and became an activist against the war, the Vietnam War. And I worked very hard on teaching myself how to write biography. And what I discovered after that was that it's an absolutely thankless task. Because if you're going to tell the truth, you won't please. There'll be many people that will be annoyed and upset with you. And so I learned that the hard way, but I still kept on going. And my favorite biography, I suppose, of mine is the one of Lillian Hellman and Dashiell Hammett. And I was just looking at A Farewell to Justice myself, which I never do, but I just was sitting here looking at it, and I noticed that Jim Garrison, when he was trying to teach himself how to be a novelist before he wrote The Star-Spangled Contract, read Dashiell Hammett, and in particular The Maltese Falcon and The Thin Man, in order to teach himself how to write a plot, which is the most difficult aspect of fiction writing, as I'm discovering again this semester. I'm teaching undergraduate creative writing, and it is really difficult to get a series of events connected to each other that move the narrative forward. It takes a lot of skill.
Right, which you absolutely have. And of course, we have talked about Jim Garrison on this show. And in fact, here's a funny thing for you too. You did this show just a little over a year ago. That was the first one I did, and it's kind of funny because when people ask me, what kind of guests do you have on your show when they haven't heard it yet, and I say, well, I started out. The first guest I had was Joan Mellen. That ends a lot of conversations, Joan,
I consider
because
that an honor, Chuck. I consider that an honor.
oh, it does, because usually they're questioning me to see if it's, well, gee, I'm an author and I really don't want to waste my time with somebody who doesn't, have serious authors on. I explained that you were my first guest, and that ends it. Guys like Larry Hancock and Stu Wexler, that conversation went on, and that was about as far as it went. And I like those guys. I don't know what your view is on them, but those were two people in particular. I remember that conversation kind of ended right there.
Well,
So,
Larry was very helpful to me. Larry Hancock long ago had thought he might write a book about Mac Wallace. And so he compiled files, and he decided that he wouldn't do it because, well, he found out what I found out really later, and that is that you couldn't prove any of the murders except for the one of John Douglas Kinzer. And so Larry sent me a box of files and notes and things the videos that he had, and he was really generous and comradely, and I really appreciated that.
oh yeah, well, Larry's just an all around kind of good guy. I mean, from my limited experiences with him, and of course, just for the listeners' clarification, Mac Wallace is always this guy that you see sucked into the LBJ was the mastermind behind the JFK assassination plots, and well. Unfortunately, despite the testimony of a few interesting characters and things like that, yeah, he was convicted of the murder of Kinzer there. But realistically, it's very difficult to create a chain of evidence that would actually tie him anywhere to the Kennedy assassination. And of course, one of the most quickly asked questions, by the way, before you came on was, please ask her to address the fingerprint. And this happened just in the past, hour and a half. I got that question privately and on Facebook and even by email. Please ask her about the fingerprint, and why is it that she says that, that this wasn't, this isn't right. And
Well, all
I
right.
happen to know kind of why, but
All the books that have been written, maybe even in the last decade, that say that Lyndon Johnson was intimately connected, was one of the masterminds, the plotter of the Kennedy assassination, all those books depend upon the fact that there was one unidentified fingerprint found on the sixth floor of the Texas School Book Depository.
right.
This fingerprint was on a carton, but the print was taken right away, and it was photographed by the FBI. It went into the exhibits of the Warren Commission, where it sat, the one unidentified print. And so, in the late 1990s, a researcher named John Fraser Harrison, J. Harrison, got into his head that fingerprint was Mac Wallace's. That was a theory. That wasn't a fact. And so Jay then got I guess he used a Xerox of the unidentified print, and he compared it to the fingerprints that were taken of Mac Wallace by the Austin Police Department at the time of the murder of the golf professional John Douglas Kinzer. And those were the two exhibits that Jay Harrison used. He then hired, or he involved, a latent print examiner from the Austin Police Department named Nathan Darby. And Darby spent, more than a year, I think, comparing Xeroxes and looking. And first he found 14 matching points, and then he said he had 34 points, and he color-coded them. And Jay wasn't satisfied yet. He hired a second person, also in Boston, also a supposedly certified latent print examiner named Harold Hofmeister. And Hofmeister seconded Nathan Darby's conclusion. Only a day or so later, when he found out, it seemed to Jay that when he told Hofmeister that it had something to do with the Kennedy assassination, it was then that Hofmeister retracted his identification. And a writer named Bar McClellan gave Hofmeister a check for $500. Nathan Darby did it for free. He didn't ask for any money. Okay, so then this is made, then announcement is made of this. And all the books that follow. Now, so the FBI, that Jay Harrison gave all of the findings to the Dallas police, I think, and they sent it to the FBI. The FBI came back 18 months later and said it's not a match. And of course, everybody poo pooed, oh, it's the FBI, what do you expect, and so forth. And weren't they rude because they didn't contact Nathan Darby directly? Okay.
Well, right, and also the idea that the FBI clearly was not most forthcoming when it came to evidence regarding the Kennedy assassination for decades.
This
So
is
I
true,
mean,
but
yeah,
you also have to look at the record of the FBI lab in general. When Mac Wallace killed Kinzer, the one thing he wanted for his defense was help from the FBI lab. And he wanted them to come and testify for him on the issue of the paraffin test, which he failed. He did kill Kinzer. There's no question about that. So, okay. So we leave it there. And then all these books start coming out. And you see, because Mac Wallace worked for, was given a job at the Department of Agriculture by Cliff Carter, who was working for Lyndon Johnson. The people then inferred that it must be Mac Wallace must have been acting on behalf of Lyndon Johnson when he was up there in the sixth floor, involving himself in the organization of the Kennedy assassination up there on the sixth floor. Okay. Now, when I got this information, I have Jay Harrison's files, and I had his Mac Wallace files. I had all the Nathan Darby files, and I had the Hofmeister records as well. And I look at it, and I thought, well, this somehow, I don't know what possessed me. I decided to find a latent print examiner that would check it out for me. If the latent print examiner said it's a match, my publisher would have been overjoyed. Better to have a serial killer and a monster in your book, a villain, Satan, than to have a guy that didn't do it. That is not the most saleable item. But I hired this latent print examiner, and he came over here in my house even, and the first thing he wanted, he didn't want to do what Nathan Darby did. He wanted a photograph of the unidentified print. However, it's very easy to get that photograph. All you have to do is ask the National Archives for it, and Martha Wagner Murphy sent me it was pristine. It had, I don't know how many, it sounds like that sexy book, how many shades of gray it had. It had, I think, levels of gray that you can only have in a photograph. You're certainly not going to have in a Xerox.
Right. When
So
you pay for
yeah.
when you pay for something to be sent from the National Archives, if you actually do go through the process and you know exactly where to find it and everything else, and you get it, when you get a photograph, you don't get these half sort of cocked images that you see sort of bandied about on the internet. You get a really clear, serious piece of photographic work, generally speaking. I mean,
It was wonderful. It was
yeah.
wonderful. So now what could the latent? Now I should tell you also that the latent print examiner, whom I found through some great good fortune, is also an officer in the International Certification Organization that certifies all latent print examiners, and which had once certified Nathan Darby and Hofmeister. So we had access to the files of the very organization. So the guy had total credibility, really. And not only that, but Nathan, and this is not the fault of these elderly gentlemen, they were using outdated technology. Whereas today, the study of fingerprints is much more advanced, and it's digital, and it's much more complex with computers. And so he examined the print. I also managed to get, and this Jay Harrison couldn't do, after a certain amount of time, and I can't recall offhand how many years it is, the military files are available to researchers. I think 62 years, I can't recall. But the dating began when Mac Wallace was in the United States Marine Corps, and the Navy took his prints. And so those prints became available to me, and because the time had passed, and I had those as well. So the latent print examiner, and I'm going to publish all his records and all the digital records and everything in an appendix to the book. And the book about Lyndon Johnson and Mac Wallace is called Faustian Bargains. It doesn't exonerate Johnson in any way for many things, but not for but it was not Mac Wallace's print up there. So then what the latent print examiner found, first of all, he compared the Austin prints and the Navy prints, and it was clear at once that these were the same person. Then he looked at that FBI photograph, the unidentified print that had been in the Warren Commission exhibits, and he finds out that this is not a match. I'm sorry, it's not a match. Now, this is what fact is fact. So then he goes to the files of the certifying organization because he has access to it. He finds that although Nathan Darby and Huff had testified in an affidavit that he was at the time that he made the identification of Mac Wallace's prints, that he had been a certified latent print examiner, he was not. His certification had expired in 1984. And so he lied about that on his affidavit, and he had never gone. In order to get recertified, you have to go do classes, same as lawyers, and take a test. And he had never done that, so he had not kept up. And the issue isn't he was certified; he had not kept up with the field and with the technology and the science. And I think the same thing was true of Hofmeister. His certification had also expired. Right. This is just a little note. It doesn't. That's what we found, and I was shocked actually when I heard that, and I asked Walt Brown, because Walt Brown is a historian, as you might know, and he had the records, and I said, Walt, listen to this, and he said to me, "We knew that. We knew that Darby and Hofmeister were not certified at the time they swore out affidavits that they were." Whoa. So you have to be so careful, really, don't you? If you can, any kind of re-investigation that you can do, you have to do. And I know I'm used to that because I did it for the Garrison case. I took Garrison's files and I went to the National Archives files, which had been subsequently released since the JFK Act was passed, and compared them to see what documents were released and what did they what answer did they give to Garrison's own files and investigation. That was what I was doing in Farewell to Justice. So this was normal to me, and I did it. And then I had to figure out how to write the book without Mac Wallace being on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. And so I called the book Faustian Bargains, which means bargains with the devil. And all the people that involved themselves with Lyndon Johnson, one way or another, were in bed with the devil. And then he said that at the end of his life, suddenly they came forward, McGeorge Bundy and Arthur Schlesinger and Bill Moyers and of course Bobby Kennedy. All those people talked about the kind of person that Lyndon Johnson was. So the book turned into the dark side of Lyndon Johnson, and also, as a case in point, how he corrupted young people, and I mean I'll call Bill Moyers was one, to work for him and to work in his devilish schemes, and we can talk about that, and Mac Wallace would be a case in point, really, of one of those, a cautionary tale.
Right. Even right, even Bob McNamara had regrets toward the end of his life about having sort of fallen under the Johnson spell, as it were. I recall having there was this seminar he gave in New York about specifically it was more about the concept of mutually assured destructive deterrent. Okay, but when questions were opened up, I remember this man hanging his head a bit when somebody pressed him on, how is it that you were able to kind of go from the Kennedy doctrine to the Johnson doctrine so seamlessly. And you could see, I mean, there was various things that he kind of indicated later in his life that maybe he wasn't so happy about having done. And that's saying something for McNamara, really.
Well, this gets us into the next topic of my new book that I'm working on now, because I have completed, I know that was one of the questions on Facebook, I have completed the book, Faustian Bargains, and it is now in the hands of the publisher. I hope they like it, and so I'm done. Good night. It's over. So now I can turn to the book I wanted to be writing for the last year, which was the one I've been doing research on, the USS Liberty. And of course, McNamara figures in that story too, because he was the person who called the admiral of one of the admirals of the Sixth Fleet, Admiral Lawrence Geiss, and told him to call back the rescue planes that the admiral, innocently enough, had sent to on behalf of the Liberty during the attack. And people there was one book written by a British author, and he was blaming McNamara. And don't misunderstand, I'm not defending McNamara, but I am saying that McNamara was a hired hand in the Johnson world. That McNamara never made any decisions on his own. It's preposterous to think that. He was doing the devil's bidding. That's why it's called Faustian Bargains, the other book, because he was doing what he was told to do. He did not make decisions on his own. I don't believe it for a minute. And so, now I lost my train of thought. We were talking about McNamara.
Right.
So although he certainly was an architect of the Vietnam War, let's not same as Dean Rusk and others, but let's realize that he was not the guiding force of that war. And in later years, he didn't. People asked him about what happened, calling back the rescue plans on the U.S. Today of the U.S. I don't know anything about it. I'm going to say about the admiral. That story. Admiral used to, he was a hired some appointed secretary, and so then I grabbed the telephone of McNamara and said, "Go back."
Hang on a second, Joan, because you're breaking up just a little bit. And this is really important what you're saying, and I don't think the listeners are getting it. So just hang on a second, because I want to see if maybe the Skype will clear up here. Because you had started talking about McNamara and the Liberty, and all of a sudden it just seemed like you started breaking up there. So let's just rewind a little bit. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you perfectly, and I believe in technology.
Yeah,
it's very worrying. We're doing the best we can. This is a new computer we're talking on, and behind it is Windows 8.
Right, and this shouldn't be a problem. But of course, you were talking about Admiral Geist and having been told to recall the wings, which were the support planes that were there to defend the Liberty. We all know the story, and this has come up on my show before. So of course, I'm really fascinated to hear what you have to say about it. And this is kind of like an unfortunate little thing here. Let's say. Can you hear me now? I hear you very well. Okay.
All right, let me go back and say that when McNamara said, "Call back those planes," Admiral Geiss didn't want to listen to him. He's a hired hand. He's just an appointed official, and so he was reluctant. I'm not going to do it. And then it was at that moment that Lyndon Johnson grabbed the telephone out of McNamara's hand and said, "I said, call back those goddamn planes. I don't want to embarrass an ally." And that was an extremely important line because it suggested that Lyndon Johnson knew exactly who had done the attack. Because when the sailors on the USS Liberty sent their distress call, they didn't have time. It's a long story there, but they had barely a minute to give their SOS, and they didn't say who was attacking them. So Lyndon Johnson knew who the attacker was. Well, what does that tell us? If ever, that tells us that Lyndon Johnson certainly had foreknowledge of the attack.
No,
he knew who was doing it, and that's incredible. That is a war crime right there. And the sailors of the USS Liberty, more recently, years later, after the millennium, filed a paper with the Department of the Army at the Pentagon, accusing Israel and also Lyndon Johnson, not by name, however, of war crimes and disobeying the military code, abandoning American servicemen in distress. And really, if we're up to Lyndon Johnson, he said, "I don't care if the ship sinks." So that means he didn't care if the 300 people on that ship drowned. I will not embarrass an ally.
Right, and speaking of war crimes, they also actually did strafe the lifeboats, which is to my knowledge is against the Geneva Conventions.
Correct. That's also a war crime, and that is they. What happened there was the captain said, "Prepare to abandon ship," and then the life rafts are lowered into the. They can't be inflated until they're lowered. I'm learning a lot really, and so they're lowered into the water, and then the Israeli the torpedo boats have come, and they machine gun the life rafts systematically. And one of the life rafts, there's torpedo boat, grabs it and hauls it on board and takes it to Israel, which it appeared later in a naval museum in Tel Aviv. So they, as a souvenir of the event. And
Wonderful.
several sailors saw that. Now, when the admiral who was in charge of the naval inquiry after the event took testimony, he took testimony from an officer named Lloyd Painter who had witnessed with his own eyes the machine gunning of the life rafts. And this admiral who was in charge of the inquiry, Isaac Kidd, the inquiry was actually ordered by the father of the senator from Arizona. That's John McCain. His father was in charge of this fleet from out of London. And when they took the testimony about the machine gunning of the life rafts, it does not appear. This information does not appear in the naval 600-page, whatever it was. That they just didn't include it in the report.
Right, which is amazing. It's all a very dirty and ugly situation that occurred here. Is what happened. And a question came up during this. Somebody wondered if you had spoken to, excuse me, his name I wrote down, Phil Turney.
Yes, Phil Turney. I've spoken to as many. Yes, I did. I spoke to as many survivors of the Liberty as I could, but I just want to mention one particular name, and that was the chief of intelligence on the USS Liberty. Now, USS Liberty was a surveillance ship, and they were spying on Egypt and on the Soviet Union. And they had all this coding, and they were reporting to the Naval Security Group and ultimately to the National Security Agency, NSA. And the person who was in charge of all that surveillance was an intelligence officer named, he was a lieutenant commander at the time, Dave Lewis. And Dave was my main source when I began this work because he was the person that Admiral Geist told the story to about Lyndon Johnson getting on the phone with him. And Admiral Geist, when Dave was on the USS America, this is the day after the attack, his eyes had been shut because paint had gotten on his eyes during the torpedo attack. So he's in the hospital on the USS America, which is part of the 6th Fleet. And Admiral Geist said, when he can see, when he's well, I want him to come to my office, which was his stateroom, and talk to me. And Admiral Geist, then Dave he got well, amazing Navy surgeon. And he could see, and he went to Admiral Geist's stateroom, and that's when Admiral Geist told the story of McNamara and Lyndon Johnson on the telephone. And Admiral Geist said to Dave Lewis, "You're not to speak of this during my lifetime. As long as I'm alive, I don't want this out." So no one knew about it. 20 years pass, and they're at the reunion. Dave is at the reunion. The sailors of the USS Liberty have an annual reunion. So Dave's there, and Admiral Moorer, who had been several times chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and was there, and he's talking to Dave. And Dave tells him, well, Admiral Geist told me not to talk about this during his lifetime. And at that point, Admiral Moorer said he died. Admiral Geist had died. And so Dave was free. And I think it's very interesting. He's a marvelous individual, Dave Lewis, fabulous. And he didn't say anything at the reunion. He waited till he got home, which is up at the Canadian border up there. And then he wrote an email to the Liberty Veterans website. And it's only a half-page long. And he told the story about the conversation that he had with Admiral Geist. And so we know, one of the things we know that is that an unimpeachable source, Dave Lewis, gave us that information about what Lyndon Johnson and McNamara said. If it were anyone else, we'd have to raise an eyebrow. but not this time. Dave Lewis, and there's no one on and associated with the USS Liberty. He was the officer in charge of all these people. Don't forget, all the cryptologists, all the people, listening to the Morse code and all the information. He was in charge. He knew things that even the captain of the ship, Captain McGonigal, did not know, because McGonigal didn't have the security clearances that Dave had. And Dave was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy, an absolutely breathtaking person. Lucky me to have gotten to know him as well as I have. And so it gives me a lot of confidence to be writing about the USS Liberty, because whenever I tell one of the survivors, if I find one, I interview everybody. And I just say that the person who's sponsoring and helping me is Dave Lewis. That opens up every door.
Well, because, I mean, and after all, you're talking about a surveillance ship and the intelligence officer on the surveillance ship. Who else is going to know everything that is going on?
The chief intelligence officer. But he wouldn't have known it if Admiral Geis felt guilty. These admirals who were on the Sixth Fleet, and I think this is true of all of them, as far as I could see, they were horrified. And they wanted to help. They're not going to leave Americans, the sailors out there undefended. And they were horrified by the whole incident. They were not in the loop. They didn't know. They had no foreknowledge that this was going to happen. They had no idea who was attacking at the time of the attack when the distress call came, and they felt guilty about abandoning the people, because they did call back the planes. They had to. Once the president of the United States, that's the commander in chief. Mm-hmm. When he says call them back, you call them back. And Admiral Geis felt very bad, and that's why he revealed all of that to Dave Lewis.
Well, and that's just amazing proof about the things that we have heard for a lot of years. To be honest with you, I mean, some of the and maybe you can clear this up for me, because I got to be honest with you, I was always a little skeptical about this, which is circulated, that McGarnacle was actually awarded the Medal of Honor, but in secret. Apparently, this is what I was told.
He was the wrong person to have gotten the Medal of Honor anyway. The person who really deserved the Medal of Honor, and Dave really said this to me, was the doctor who recently died in the last month or so, Dr. Kiefer, who was he was shot himself with shrapnel and all of this. He puts on a life jacket very tight so that the blood he wouldn't bleed out. And he starts giving blood transfusions and taking care of all these people with no help from anybody from our end, and trying to keep the people alive as best as he could. Now, Captain McGonigal, when he was interviewed by Isaac Kidd, Admiral Kidd, during that naval inquiry, lied. Mm-hmm. There's no question, he lied. He didn't talk about as you say, Chuck, the machine gunning of the life rafts. He lied about the length of time that the attack took. Like he said 8 minutes, and it was nearly 2 hours, and many other distortions of the truth. And the result of that, he cooperated with the false inquiry, and the result of that was he was promoted, and he was given another command, another ship, whereas he was really at the end of his career at that time, and he was given these 2 plums, and so it was a what's the right word for that? Another Faustian bargain, if you like. He made the bargain to tell the lies, and he got rewarded for it. Now, even so, when he was awarded the Medal of Honor, it was given to him at the Navy Yard, and the Secretary of the Navy, I'm not sure if he was there or not, but certainly one of the facts is that when the United States awards a Medal of Honor, there's a press release. And in this case, there was no press release, and you're supposed to be given the Medal of Honor at the White House by the President of the United States, and he didn't. That didn't happen. He was at some Navy yard, and one of the Lloyd Painter, whom I mentioned earlier, told many people on the USS Liberty got Purple Hearts, and when Lloyd Painter got his in Germany. And, this is, of course, after the attack, and he was told when he was given his Purple Heart, and don't tell anyone where you got it. And so he's, and I tell you, Lloyd Painter, after leaving the Navy, joined the Secret Service. And I think one of the assignments that he had Could it be? Maybe. I'm not positive. I should ask him about this. I think he guarded Mamie Eisenhower. Obviously after the Eisenhower presidency.
Right.
That was one of the people, and I can't remember who else he did. But anyway, he another unimpeachable source too. And he, as I said before, he saw the life rafts being machine gunned.
Well, right, and I mean, like I said, the whole event was entirely disgusting, and the cover-up of it, ever after, is also equally repulsive in my eyes. And the motives for this are all over the place. Of course, there's a lot to be said for the United States military and intelligence services covering for a lot of things like this. Over the years, I mean, we've learned about, the Gulf of Tonkin incident being what it actually is. I mean, this is, it's almost par for the course, but at the same time, it's still kind of a shock when you dig into these things and you find that it's the actual reality, isn't it?
Oh, yes, I agree with you, absolutely. All the presidents since Johnson covered it up. And the sailors have been trying so hard to get acknowledged, to have their testimony taken, to be taken seriously, and not a single member of Congress would support their cause. Now, one person who did support their cause was the son of Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson, for the younger listeners, ran against President Eisenhower twice, in 1952 and in 1956. He was a liberal Democrat. Mm-hmm. And his son, Adlai Stevenson III, was also a United States Senator. And he tried to raise the issue of the USS Liberty. Well, the Israel lobby got on his case and pretty much ensured that he did not get reelected up there in the state of Illinois, where the Stevensons are from. And it was, they come in at you, and they have a lot of power. And people are willing to accept that. I really don't understand why. Anyway, we who are researchers, historians, we're trying to find the truth, and nothing can stop us. And I think our model is Jim Garrison, who, I don't care what anyone says, did not want money, did not want fame and fortune. He could have been governor of Louisiana very easily. He was very popular. And the polls show it, the polls that were taken by a historian named John Tarver, who worked for Governor McKeithen in Louisiana. He could have become governor, and he gave it all up for trying to figure out what happened to President Kennedy. So that's a model for you take the risks. You just give up the idea that you're going to make money, that you're going to be famous, you're going to win the Pulitzer Prize if you're a historian, or the National Book Award, or anything else. And what you just have to be content with, that you tell the truth as best as you can find it.
And I'll tell you, a lot of the subject matter that you've covered, I find it extremely remarkable that you haven't actually had any sort of backlash, because I mean you're a very recognizable figure. You're still involved in academia. I mean, and some people have reported that they get trouble, with their jobs because of the positions that they put forth in a lot of their books. And of course, yours are not exactly right along with the mainstream history. A lot of them, Garrison, the way that Garrison was being presented to the world for the very longest time, and I think still to this day in a lot of places in academia, is as a very marginal figure. But I do want to turn to the Garrison thing really quickly, because somebody, let me see if I can sort this out. The question is basically about, I guess you were on Black Op Radio recently, and you had mentioned Oswald's girlfriend. And first of all, you weren't identifying Judith Very Baker, I'm sure. Okay, just let's make that clear. Secondly, who was it that you were talking about that was Oswald's girlfriend that you knew something about?
I think you might have that a little bit off. I don't like to talk about that case, because all I can say, and I've said it before, I won't go. All I can say is that in the many years that I was in the state of Louisiana studying the summer of 1963, as well as the Garrison case, but also what Garrison looked at, which was Oswald's residence in New Orleans and also in north of Baton Rouge in the summer of 1963, Not a single person whom I interviewed. And I interviewed for that book, if you look at the acknowledgments, not all of them were in Baton Rouge, but 1,200 people, I think. And nobody had ever heard of this person or remembered her or knew of her.
Oh no,
And
I thought that maybe
I
this was a separate person.
I don't know who
Um,
else we could be talking about. It must be that it's. I don't know who else we're talking about.
oh, okay. I'm just asking the question because I didn't actually hear the show, so I wasn't aware of it.
I
I
don't know.
thought
I
maybe.
thought I was on. Wasn't I on Black Op Radio discussing Bill O'Reilly and or was it John McAdams and his problems with being censored by Marquette University?
It might have been the McAdams thing that I think the McAdams thing was the last thing I heard you
Yeah,
speaking
it might not
about.
have been.
So
I was speaking about O'Reilly on other venues, maybe.
right. Well, yeah. I
Because he had
mean,
said that he was like, it's just too ridiculous. We don't want to need to waste our time on it.
well,
He
really
is,
quickly
yeah.
though, really quickly, just I do want to address that only because Jack Blood is simulcast on this network, so I want to address that real quick.
Well, some of the people misunderstood and what I said. I certainly did not say, for the record, that Israel did not attack the USS Liberty. That's ludicrous. So that's certainly not true. I might well have said that Lyndon Johnson was not behind the plot to murder President Kennedy. I certainly might have said that because I
Hmm.
don't believe that he was. The Louisiana evidence, which all these Texas people are very ignore as if it didn't exist,
Right.
show footprints of CIA and not Lyndon Johnson.
Right.
It's not so easy here. On the USS Liberty case, one of the people who, many people, of course, immediately defended Israel and said they'd only made a mistake. They thought it was an Egyptian freighter and it wasn't planned ahead. It wasn't premeditated. And one of the people who challenged that view was Richard Helms. The CIA was not behind the USS Liberty attack.
No.
Sorry, they're not. I mean, you can't have one. You're going to have one villain here, but they were not involved in that. And Helms came out and said he was disgusted by. I mean, he didn't say these was. It was clear. He's on film on the documentary film "Dead in the Water," where you could see he's absolutely contemptuous of McNamara. And when he's asked some question by a reporter, he says, "You go ask McNamara. I'm not answering those questions. You go ask McNamara."
Which,
CIA was
yeah.
put in a position where they had to keep the cover up. But that didn't mean that Helms, who was a figure beyond the norm, he was high up in this chain, came right out and said, there's no way that was a mistake.
Yeah, right, and of course, it would make sense to go question McNamara because he was the Secretary of Defense.
Well,
You
he got
know.
on the phone and he said, call back the planes. He's right in there,
Right.
So, but no. But as far as that program, some people listened to that. They didn't understand. It's very hard to give your views on the radio, I guess, and develop it and just say things, make an assertion. But you see, we have so much CIA footprint on the Kennedy assassination that you just can't put the planning of this crime at the door of Ed Clark or Cliff Carter or Lyndon Johnson or any combination of these people, and as if it were, as somebody said in one of the videos, an example of Texas justice with
Yeah.
Texas participants only. That just isn't true.
Yeah, that's one of those things, and I did a show recently called JFK Myths, and this was one of the things I kind of tackled is that, listen, for those of you that think LBJ was the mastermind of this whole thing, you got to understand, first of all, you generally would reward the mastermind, or the mastermind would have the sense to be rewarded. What did he have, really, but another shadow presidency and a death only a few years later afterwards, pretty much broken, his legacy destroyed. There wasn't much there. I mean, plenty of crimes. It's not as though Lyndon Johnson is an innocent individual in history's books. I point out the fact that the Bobby Baker scandal is not something that people discovered in later years. I mean, that was being broadcast on the radio the same day that they were talking about Kennedy arriving in Dallas. Come on.
Well, Lyndon Johnson, it is true, defending those people, wanted to be president of the United States since he was a kid, I think. He had the grandiose idea that somehow he was going to be able to do it, and through wheeling and dealing and manipulating, he thought he could do it. Now, I don't know where along, but one of the things we forget about Johnson is that he was an immensely provincial. He was shrewd, and he was down and dirty, but he really was a provincial, because how could he not have known that he was put into the presidency for a purpose, and that purpose was to create that war. And I think, as people have quoted, that it's from the Stanley Cornell History of Vietnam, when Christmas Eve, a talk where Johnson is at some party with the Joint Chiefs, and he says, "Get me elected," because he had to get elected in 1964. "Let me get elected, and I'll give you your war." So he knew what his assignment was,
Right.
and he did it, and it was worth it to him, except that he had never imagined, that the whole country would oppose the war. We had never had that before. I don't know if we did. I mean, did we ever have a situation where hundreds of thousands of people are out in the street protesting against a war?
No.
And in later years, when Johnson is dying there, up there, and he's on the ranch, and he's thinking back on his regrets, one of the things he said was, one of the things he would do over was he wouldn't have allowed the war to be broadcast on national television every night, so that people could see soldiers shooting Vietnamese peasants and monks burning themselves, and creating so much horror at this war. He would have kept it off the television. And I think in later years, if you look at Barack Obama, we don't see the war on the television every night. The media know better than to show. In fact, they weren't even allowed to photograph when the bodies came back in Delaware, wasn't it, in Dover, Delaware? They didn't show those. You're not allowed to show those even on television when all the dead bodies come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. So subsequently, presidents have learned that one way to stifle dissent is to keep the images off the media.
Well, right. If you keep it nice and quiet, I mean, you can be involved in a place like Afghanistan for longer than we were involved in Vietnam now, pretty reasonably without a whole lot of public backlash, right?
Well, and also then there are other ways of dealing with that backlash. I mean, some of the protests in the early days of the Iraq War, people were sort of put behind barricades with now bathrooms, and it became in the days of the Vietnam War, you could go in Central Park and protest every which place and go in the street, and it was much freer. It was a much freer society then.
Well, in the post 9/11 reality, we now live in a place where you have free speech zones, which is one of the great oxymorons of American society at this point in time. I did not know that your free speech would be restricted to a zone, but enough of my politics. Anyway, it is all, and all this stuff ties together. This is what the scary part is to me, because look, I mean, I still contend, and I know that some people don't like this, but I still contend that, that Kennedy, had he remained in office, was not going to involve us in the adventure we ended up becoming embroiled in Vietnam. I really don't believe that he was going to do that.
That's a fact. And if you want the proof of that, you want the evidence, the best place to look is in a book called Lessons in Disaster, which was the autobiography of not our favorite figure, McGeorge Bundy, that was completed by his student, Gordon Goldstein. And McGeorge Bundy describes how practically on a daily basis, the cabinet were trying to pressure John F. Kennedy to send ground troops to Vietnam. Send 10, send 100, send 200, whatever, and he would resist alone. He was all alone. He was resisting every single time they did it, and they did it on a regular basis. He resisted, and it's pretty well known. And Arthur Schlesinger is the source that of the influence that General MacArthur had on Kennedy. When MacArthur came to see Kennedy, it's a famous where he came to the White House, I think, and he said, "You'll never win a land war in Asia." Mm-hmm. He knew. And so that was and Kennedy wrote an aide memoir, a kind of this document. Probably we could find it if we looked in the Kennedy Library, of the influence that MacArthur had on him regarding a land war in Asia. And I think he stuck to that. He listened. He didn't know much about those things, really. And he listened to this. MacArthur certainly knew. And he was not going to do it. There's no question. But take a look at that book about McGeorge Bundy.
Well, let me back you up just a little more too, because if one decides to dig into the audio archives at the Kennedy Library, you can find tapes of these meetings where he's got. It sounds like he's surrounded at a table by guys trying to pressure him to do this. I mean, literally, you can hear some of these meetings, not all of them. Some parts are redacted for national security reasons, blah blah blah. But the thing is, you can still hear this going on, and even when Kennedy leaves the room, you can actually hear some of these military advisors complaining that they can't get him to basically take a bite on this. You know.
It was very courageous of him. Talking about profiles and courage, if we want to use that metaphor, very courageous to I guess I don't know what we would attribute it. Nobody's written a really good book on Kennedy, have they? Is there really a really great book about John F. Kennedy? The one that I like best is Richard Reeves' book. It's titled President Kennedy. But it's good, but it's not the real big book. I wonder if how somebody should do it. Anyway.
Well, yeah, a definitive book on Kennedy himself. It's hard. It's hard to find one. I can't actually say that I've read one that really covers him as a person and what he went through.
And the other thing, I want to add one other thing about Kennedy, and that was he wasn't giving Israel carte blanche. And he wanted to have inspections of the nuclear facilities in Israel at Demorah. And that all went away when Johnson became president.
Well, not only that, but recently articles have circulated regarding the Kennedys' position on AIPAC and wanting them to be registered as a foreign entity in this country, and apparently that never happened either post-assassination.
I'd like to see that, by the way, if you have a document on that, because that's interesting, but it fits in with everything that we've been saying.
Yeah, interesting, exactly. And I say again that, the reason why this is still so important, this kind of stuff, when, people say to me, well, look, it's more than half a century ago, what difference does it make now? Well, tell me that Israel is still not playing a huge part in the world's, the entire world stage when it comes to warfare, when it comes to espionage, when it comes to... So the American government's position regarding the way that they handle Israel has a lot to do with a lot of the things that they do allow out on the mainstream news at this point. Okay?
Well, Johnson opened that door. That was a door Johnson opened, along with his national security advisor, W. Walt Rostow. One of the things that I found in my research that was interesting, I was very interested in a figure called Otto Otepka, who was part of the security office of the State Department. And one of the things that happened when John F. Kennedy was first elected, and this is before the inauguration, in December 1960, Bobby Kennedy goes to meet with Otto Otepka, because Otepka had to give security clearances to the Kennedy appointees. And on the list of Kennedy appointees, I have to tell you, was W. Rostow. And Otto Otepka said, I didn't like him. Something about him wasn't right. Didn't want to give him the security clearance. Mm-hmm. And he eventually did. But he was part of the Kennedy administration before he was the Johnson person. But he was a pernicious figure. And Otto Otepka was a conservative now. He was a conservative. But he saw right away this is not a person that he really thought should be in the United States government.
Oh, right. And I mean, it's also significant to mention because people often say, well, it was the same people in the Johnson administration that were in the Kennedy administration, so it's the same policy. This is a complete ridiculous fallacy. If anything, what happened is that Johnson very shrewdly maintained them so that he could sort of continue the appearance of, being a legitimate leader. Essentially, look, I've still got the same people. I mean, the country was more willing to accept things, maybe if he kept Kennedy's people in place.
Listen, Chuck, I was horrified when Kennedy made those appointments. Dean Rusk, Robert McNamara, McGeorge Bundy. these people were not liberals. These people were not going to fulfill whatever vision President Kennedy had. These people were no good, and that they did either it's naivete or whether it was the question is who had. Remember, I use this in the Farewell to Justice. I can't resist quoting it all the time. Gerald Patrick Hemmings telling me that John F. Kennedy was the last president who thought he could take power, thought he could. And maybe one of the ways he thought he could maintain it was to put these kinds of people into the cabinet. You see the same thing with Barack Obama, by the way. He put George Bush's people in, Robert Gates, etc. And if you're going to change things, you don't do this. And I think that Kennedy, either they were naive or they were playing along. They were not radicals.
Right.
You and I would not put with George Bundy, and a brother was in the CIA, William Bundy, and all that, very close to the agency. The agency then comes into play in the murder of President Kennedy. They didn't really understand what they were dealing with.
Yeah, I don't think they had any sort of grasp as to how the intelligence community was functioning at that point in time.
Kennedy learned soon enough.
Oh, he learned very quickly.
Fights with them right away, but it was too late.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, and this is, but it's not the same thing though when Johnson stepped in there, because it's just a totally different situation. Kennedy, again, I mean, the Bay of Pigs is a perfect example of, he was being manipulated by these guys who had been around for a long time. I mean, Dulles, along with his brother, had run so much of policy at that point in time. He sort of, I think he deferred to them, being in the position he was in, being, the young president and everything like that. I think that's what actually happened,
Well,
I mean, this is all supposition, mind you, but I mean, I'm just saying, and I'm very glad that
listen,
you brought up
they were not, they were, John F. Kennedy, as a senator, he was a Cold War liberal, if a liberal at all. He was not really, he was on the conservative side. If you remember, you probably don't, if you remember the debates with Nixon, he was not that different from Nixon. And it was only later, I think, that he begins to, and I think he suffered when he realized that CIA was making policy. He was shocked, I think. They're making policy. I'll get these bastards. This is a quote from Richard Reeves' book. I'll get these bastards if it's the last thing I do. And then what he did was, which is the most outrageous thing that he did, was to try to cut the powers of CIA, to try to limit the authority of the Director of Central Intelligence, to try to cut their budget. This is unheard of, see, because Dulles always knew that he could have any amount of money that he wanted, and he would make these fake appearances. And I think it's in Burton Hersh's book, The Old Boys, where Alan Dulles goes to Congress and makes in his tweed suit with the pipe, and talks about what he needs, and nobody challenges a word he says. Well, when Kennedy saw what they were doing, and because he was rich, and because he was kind of arrogant, if you like. And he just figured, who are these people that they're really running the government? And he challenges them, and they cut him down, I think. Right.
Okay. So two things have come up in text questions, really quickly.
Are you getting texts while we're talking?
Yeah. On the Skype. What happens is I'm getting these messages through the Skype because I haven't thrown open the phone lines for anybody yet. We could do that if you want, but I'm getting text questions as they're listening. They wanted to know. Well, okay, let's separate this because this is long. All right. First thing is this: the Bill O'Reilly thing, which you mentioned earlier, and you had mentioned other places. Let me clarify something really quickly. Bill O'Reilly made a statement first. This is what is famously known. It made a statement first to the public's mind on a show called Inside Edition. And I made sure to review this earlier today just to make sure I knew what I was talking about. He was the talking head on Inside Edition discussing the DeMornshields murder. Okay. Now, on there, he does not say that he was present or knocking on the door at the time DeMornshields blew his brains out, which he did in Florida. Okay, but he did say that he had heard about this, and that investigators for the House Select Committee had uncovered some interesting things regarding Shield and Oswald and all of this kind of stuff. That he did say on an Inside Edition program in the 90s. Okay, now recently there was, of course, the Bill O'Reilly, killing somebody books, because he's done killing Kennedy, killing Lincoln, killing Jesus, and killing Patton now. Everything except Bill O'Reilly killing his own career or killing the truth. But at this, and that's my commentary. Don't blame Joan for that. Okay. But the reality is, this guy with a series of books, at one point, one of the printings of his Kennedy book, he states that he was, banging on the door at the time of the gunshot to Shields, and it turns out that he wasn't. Okay.
That's right. And, there's that tape where he's talking on the telephone. Gaten Fonzie is taping him while he's talking to Gaten Fonzie on the phone. Gaten Fonzie is the investigator who left his card, as famously, at the house where Shield was staying in Florida, Palm Beach County, I think. And so then Shield calls up Gaten Fonzie and says, I was standing on, he says he was going to Florida, which proves that he wasn't there at the time when he said he was there, because he's going to go there either that night or the next morning, depending on when he could get a flight. And this contradicts the later statement that he said he was actually at the door when he heard the gunshot. Now, Bill O'Reilly is so insignificant a figure in what we're worrying about here and all these big issues that I don't know if who would expect him to tell the truth. Now, as far as Shield is concerned, I did this book called Our Man in Haiti, and what interested me on that subject, on the death of Shield, was my interview with Joe Dreyer, who lived in Palm Beach. And when Shield went over there to visit, he was visiting, and he calls up Joe because he knew Joe Dreyer from Haiti. Joe Dreyer had plantations of something called Kenaf, Kenaf, as in Frank. And that's some kind of jute, like rope. And they make it in India and Pakistan, and Joe was going to challenge the world market on jute, on rope, on carpets, on burlap sacks, and so forth. So Joe Dreyer got to know Shield. So when Shield came to Palm Beach County, he calls up Dreyer and he says, Joe, I want to talk about something. There's something that's on my mind that I want to talk about. And can you have lunch? So he wanted to have lunch that day, urgent. So Joe, was very close to U.S. Marine Intelligence, knew all the agencies, knew all the agents, knew everything. Very worldly individual, international figure. And he said, I can't do it today, George. How about tomorrow? Now, today turned out to be the day that he was shot. He had made the date with Joe for the next day. Now, the idea, would he have shot himself if he already had a plan to talk to Joe and talk to him about this matter that concerned him greatly, that he wanted? And Joe is a very easy guy to talk to and a very reasonable man. And I can understand if you had to choose somebody to confide in, you would very likely choose Joe Dreyer. You know who else knew Joe Dreyer? Before he had the Kenaf plantations in Haiti, he had plantations in Cuba, and he got to know Ernest Hemingway. And and Joe married a Cuban woman, and Hemingway attended his wedding, and was one of the testigos, witnesses to the wedding. So it has that aspect of it. Anyway, Joe was convinced that Shield could not have shot himself, given that he was so urgently interested in talking to Joe. And then Joe went over there and did a little investigating, and he talked to the maid in the house, and he found out that she heard a car drive away shortly after the shooting of Shield. So those two pieces, it's circumstantial evidence, but as I learned on Law and Order, my favorite TV show, 90% of cases are based on circumstantial evidence, according to the district attorney on the show. So I don't know. I just throw that into the situation. I don't want to say that Shield shot himself. Oh, there's more evidence. There's also the bullets, because the gun didn't have any bullets, and his daughter testified to that, Shield's daughter, that there was no gun there. He's not a guy with guns. either. If you look at the whole history of the life of George de Mohrenschildt, he's sort of a playboy and a man for sale, a man who's rented himself out to various intelligence services, among them the French and also the United States.
which
And we
makes
know that, of course, that J. Walton Moore, who headed the CIA field office in Dallas, sent de Mohrenschildt along with Colonel Orloff there to go see what's doing with to keep an eye on Oswald, to be the handler of Oswald in Texas that Clay Shaw was in Louisiana.
right. I was just going to say, of course, that's really fascinating considering the fact that he was actually prompted by Moore to go and pretty much look in on Oswald and see what's going on.
Well, that's an assignment.
Yeah.
That's an assignment. And so I don't know why people. I mean, I assume this was common knowledge in the research community. I don't understand how, because after all, he sent de Mohrenschildt to Yugoslavia under the International Cooperation Administration, which is one of the fronts for CIA. Later, it would become AID, Agency International Development, one a similar organization. File's gone. But they sent de Mohrenschildt to Yugoslavia, to Hungary, to Ghana, to various places in the late 1950s. So this business with Oswald is not the first assignment that de Mohrenschildt has from CIA.
No, and also kind of sensible that he would feel the need to write a letter to George H.W. Bush, who despite his denials, was certainly involved in intelligence activity previous to the time that he became the head of the CIA in, 1976, I think. Okay.
Mohrenschildt wanted, at the end there, he had this so-called contract with the government of Haiti, and Duvalier was not paying him. And de Mohrenschildt he tried to enlist various people. When he got back broke to the United States, and among the people he enlisted was H.W. Bush, who was the roommate of, let me get this straight, he was the roommate of the stepson of de Mohrenschildt's brother. Isn't that it? I can't remember, but it's very distant acquaintance,
Right.
And so anyway, Bush just wrote a very nasty response, which is available everywhere. You can see it, and also for those who are interested in the figure of de Mohrenschildt, I wrote a whole book about de Mohrenschildt in Haiti, and also a background of de Mohrenschildt leading up to that. But for those who are further interested in de Mohrenschildt, I call your attention to 11 volumes of softcover books by Bruce Adamson.
Right, Bruce Campbell Adamson, yes.
Who has did a lot of research on de Mohrenschildt, and I acknowledge that in my book because he pointed me to many interesting points. One of the things that Bruce discovered was that Lyndon Johnson, when he got Mac Wallace a job with Temco, TEMCO. This is one of the businesses of David Harold Byrd, who owned the school book depository at the time of the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. Well, he got Mac Wallace a job at Temco. Another person whom Lyndon Johnson got a job at Temco was the father or the husband, God help me, of one of his secretaries, Marie Fehmer, Fehmer. It's a father or her husband. God, boy, you forget these things. I have to look in my own book to remember that. that Raymond Fehmer. But that research was developed by Bruce Adamson.
Well, right, and also in Our Man in Haiti is a rather fascinating and really unique kind of synopsis, giving you a flavor for what was actually going on in Haiti at the time, because there's not a lot of literature on that.
I got the literature from. I did that. That I did. No one else had. I hate to say praise of myself, but that came from military intelligence files. The 902nd, called 90 Deuce. It was the 902nd Military Intelligence, whatever, and those files were in the National Archives, and they was following de Mohrenschildt, and they were also following the other character in my book, whose name is Clemar Joseph Charles, who was a figure whom de Mohrenschildt was attached to in the way that he had been attached to Oswald, and who was hoping that CIA would help him become president of the Republic of Haiti by overthrowing Duvalier. And Charles came to Washington and met with CIA and was hoping that would be his. So he's working for Duvalier. and he's a banker. He runs a commercial bank in Port-au-Prince, and he's also hoping CIA is going to overthrow Duvalier for him. But you have to remember that part of that time, President Kennedy was the president, and he wasn't going to get involved there with, after the Bay of Pigs, you can imagine, to start in Haiti. And so somehow CIA had to back off. And whatever their intentions had been to overthrow Duvalier, they decided not to do it.
Right, which and I got to be honest with you, I was in the middle of trying to praise you about it, so you didn't have to praise yourself. The fact is, I would know nothing about those characters, and Haiti would not even be one of the areas of the world where I thought this type of intrigue was going on, had it not been for your book on George de Mohrenschildt, because it's just one of those things that. Look, I can't study everything, and to be honest with you, it was really kind of refreshing to see something entirely unique. So anybody who wants to learn about that, I definitely recommend Our Man in Haiti. Plus, it gives you, I'll just be blunt, gives you a hell of a snapshot of this figure that everybody seems to mention, but nobody has actually done a really good definitive job on, with the exception of a Bruce Campbell Adamson, who doesn't really get as much attention as he deserved for all the years' work he did.
He didn't go into Haiti so much. And I have to give credit also for helping to give us those scenes in my book about the dinner parties that George de Mohrenschildt held and who the guests were. One of them was that father of the man who was killed with Princess Diana, Fayed. And all that, it comes from CIA's own records, because CIA attached one of their assets to de Mohrenschildt, and he befriended de Mohrenschildt, and he wrote reports. Mm-hmm. So we have the conversations, what everybody said at dinner. Then they had the drinks, then they sat down, and de Mohrenschildt said this, and communism is that, and all that in the United States. And so they're having all this dialogue and these interesting conversations. And it's all recorded by CIA. Who else? How would we ever have gotten that information?
Right. That's like one of those, unless somebody happened to be carrying a tape recorder randomly, you weren't going to get it, and that was not highly likely in that situation. So, guess what? Yeah, they did.
Reporter was good. He copied down the dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
What he didn't copy down, which we would have done, is what they ate, what food they had, what they ate, that sort of local color. He didn't do that, but he got everybody's conversation.
Well, see, that's the thing. To set that kind of scene, first of all, somebody who wants to paint a mental picture, they were just looking for specific pieces of information that could be drawn out of the conversations and things like that. So, of course, they're not going to give us all that, but that would have been nice as well, Somewhere, I guarantee you that those details are known, though. I almost promise you that somebody knows exactly who drank what, who had what, and everything else. It's just that we haven't seen them yet.
De Mohrenschildt's daughter, I don't know if I never met her, and I don't know. She might know, because she was visiting there at a certain period of time. We see her being involved with Mohammed Fayed, the one that he went on to own Harrods department store in London. And also owned a sports team, soccer teams. Is that, would we call that soccer?
I think they call it football over there, but
football team. He owned a football. I don't remember which one, but that's a big thing to own one of those teams.
Oh yeah, especially over there, and and as you strange nexus once again. Yeah, Dodi Fayed was killed with Princess Diana. That with the whole thing.
Anyway, there he is, and no one knows who he is. He's suddenly he appears, and he's sitting at the dinner table at de Mohrenschildt's. That was fun to write, I have to say. I enjoyed it. And then I also enjoyed the extensive way that James Angleton and John Whitten, also known as John Celso, did background checks on every single person who wrote a letter to George de Mohrenschildt when he was in Haiti. And we see those reports. And those reports, what CIA did, they stole it out of the post office, and then they gave those names to the FBI. And they enlisted, the FBI didn't like it, because then see what CIA did was to say it's really the FBI's idea to investigate these people, but it wasn't. It was CIA wanting, and nothing came of it. But in the course of it, we could see who was CIA connected and who isn't.
Well,
Pan
yeah.
American Airways, for example, and the people who worked for them were CIA.
See, and this is the amazing type of stuff and believe me, we're only scratching the surface of what's in Our Man in Haiti. I'm telling you, definitely, if you don't want to read about Garrison, which I'm telling you, you need to get both of Joan's books on Garrison, because first of all, Farewell to Justice is excellent when it comes to really breaking down the realities about what happened in his investigation, which was very much marginalized, and I know it's been sort of immortalized in the Oliver Stone film at this point, but let me just say this really quickly, and I'll move away from that. It's simple. Kevin Costner is not a good Jim Garrison. Next, the other volume that Joan does on Garrison is just amazing because it actually gives you a flavor for what kind of man this was. And
I don't know
definitely.
why more people don't read that book.
Mm,
You can get it on Amazon. It's called Jim Garrison: His Life and Times, and it's about his childhood, his when he was in the army, his schooling, when he was in Europe, when they liberated Dachau concentration camp, then his early days as an assistant district attorney, and then up to he runs for district attorney, and it ends with the moment when he decides to investigate the Kennedy assassination. But I really was, and also it shows his liberalism, his interest in the First Amendment, his being sued by the judges for defamation, and the case went all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, and became part of the same issue as New York Times versus Sullivan, and extends the freedom of the First Amendment to criticism of public officials, namely the judges that Garrison had attacked and called them sacred cows, and they don't go to work on Fridays, and all of this thing.
right.
And I thought that was really, and the opinion on Garrison versus Louisiana was written by William Brennan, who was the most liberal member of the United States Supreme Court in the Warren Court. So I don't know why. I mean, I think it's interesting, but there's still, as you said, Chuck, there's a lot of hesitation still. The CIA really did a good job on public opinion on Jim Garrison. And then they did a job on Oliver Stone. In case people would change their minds as a result of the film, they did a tremendous attack on his film, as we know.
Right.
So it's very hard to give the figure of Garrison. More and more time elapses, and it's hard to not for me, it isn't, of course, because I'm sure of this, and I'm really sure of Garrison, of the truth of Garrison's investigation.
Well, not only that, but I mean, taking a look at a guy who in the South, at that time was unwilling to, prosecute people for obscenities, was unwilling to, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but that's pretty remarkable in and of itself.
Another thing is, he defended the First Amendment and he also defended sexuality. And, that was, in those days, homosexuality was against the law, and he refused to prosecute cases of homosexuality. It was considered a crime against nature in Louisiana, and he said that he refused to prosecute those cases as district attorney. Mm-hmm. He fought for James Baldwin's book, Another Country, I think. That was... if I'm not mistaken about that, that was banned in the Doubleday bookstore, and the bookstore owner, the manager, was arrested, and he fought against that. And, he really was, truly liberal in the best sense of that word. And,
right. Actually, somebody who believed that, people had their rights. Your constitutional rights were actually being defended by a district attorney in Louisiana.
But I want to say that when I appeared about a year ago at the Louisiana Historical Association, I got attacked by people in the audience who said that Garrison prosecuted Shaw because he was homosexual, which is so untrue. And that Garrison outed Shaw, and this is totally false, because in fact, the whole New Orleans knew that Shaw was homosexual. It was not a secret, nor did Shaw keep it a secret, because during Mardi Gras he went out as in the costume, and everybody had big parties, and it was a free and easy atmosphere. And certainly Garrison never even mentioned, in the 2 years of the investigation, never once publicly mentioned Shaw's sexuality, and didn't use it at the trial in any way. and did not out Shaw, false, because everybody knew that he was Clay Bertrand. If you all you had to do was go to the quarter and talk to in any one of the places like Lucky Pierre's, and where Barbara Bennett, who was a singer there, told me when she saw Shaw being arrested on television on March 1st, 1967. Oh, well, there's Clay Bertrand.
Mm.
And just naturally. She hated Garrison, but that was another story, because Garrison and his office, they were cracking down on abuses in the quarter, in the bars, drinking and cheating people, men, and having sex in the booths and all of this. And so the people in the quarter thought that Garrison damaged the culture of the quarter, the free and easy culture, which you could make a case for that. Many bars were shut down. But that's why the people in the quarter didn't like Garrison, but it certainly had nothing to do with his treatment of Shaw and Shaw's sexuality. False. And all these people are ganging up on me. I mean, it was a very unpleasant experience. I never expected it in a million years. This was 1 year ago.
I didn't even know about that, but I do know that it's the idea that somebody would say, because I mean, look, I'm not as familiar with the case as you are, but I know a little something about this. The fact that somebody would say that he prosecuted Shaw because he was homosexual and made it a point. All you got to do is look at the transcripts of that trial, and where can you find me the lines being drawn or the point being driven home by the prosecution anywhere in there, that he's a homosexual? I mean, I'm sure you've been through those transcripts. Did you find it in there somewhere?
No, it's not there, and those transcripts are available because, as we know, a police officer named Gary Raymond was ordered by Harry Connick, who succeeded Garrison as district attorney, and Connick saw the files. He wanted to throw it all out, burn it in the incinerator, and Gary Raymond took those transcripts and put it in his car. I think these are also the grand jury transcripts, and also maybe also the trial transcripts. I'm not sure, but anyway, and he saved a lot of that material, and it's all available now. I think Rex Bradford has made it available either on the History Matters website or other website. You can find the trial transcripts, the testimonies, and also the grand jury testimonies, including Marina Oswald and Ruth Payne and Kerry Thornley and all of those.
Right. It's nearly complete. There's a couple of people's testimonies missing, but it's nearly complete, and you can actually get that at the Assassination Record Archives website. I think it's the AARC. If you enter that into a search engine, you can find it on the internet. Of course, you can find all of Joan Mellen's work. And meanwhile, we've only touched upon, 5 or 6 books that you've written. I know that it's more than 20 at this point. And you can see all that stuff if you want just by going to Joan Mellen, actually. Joan Mellen, and Mellen is spelled M-E-L-L-E-N, by the way. It's a WordPress site, but you can go there and you can see a whole lot of the books that she's written. I don't know if it's been updated recently.
I put on there some of the interviews. If I get the link from one of the radio programs, I put one. I did a program on for Mob Chronicles. It seems odd, right? Because Garrison was accused of being soft on the mafia. And that was false, absolutely false. And I was looking at my own book. I haven't read it in so long, but I looked at it and I could see how many times Garrison zeroed in on the mob connections of Oswald and of and everything. And when I first started this work, I have to say, I don't usually want to talk about people, but I have to say that when I first started this work, and I picked up a book by Peter Dale Scott accusing Garrison of somehow protecting the mafia, I was so horrified by that, and I studied it for many years after that. It was all false. What is that about? I just can't understand why the hostility toward Garrison by Peter Dale Scott and various friends of his. Where does this come from?
Well,
I was before my time. When I first started, I see it. What is this about? It's just false.
Well, I could give you what my impression is of that particular line of reasoning. This is what I gather, okay? And I could be entirely wrong, but this is just my sense of things. What happens here is that Garrison did not point the finger directly at the mafia. Okay, there are a lot of people out there that want to insist that this was a mob hit on Kennedy, that they were the only engineers who would have done the job that was done, et cetera, and that's all there is to it. Beginning and ending with the with La Cosa Nostra, that's all they want to hear. And here's the problem: Garrison found evidence that led him toward that direction, but that wasn't the figure he was able to lay his hands on with good evidence. I mean, that's my total impression here, and I
He
think that
knew
they
that
sent
mafia
it for that
people were
reason.
enlisted. He knew that mafia people were enlisted, but he didn't believe that they were the masterminds behind the assassination. And
Right.
I just want to put that in a little context, and that is that you recall that document of April 1967, which CIA issues and tells its media assets ways that they could answer. This was written by Helms, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
ways that they should answer criticisms of the Warren Report. And one of the ways is, of course, to accuse the KGB and the Soviet Union of being involved in it. But also, one of the ways, as the years passed, that CIA countered criticism of CIA's own involvement in this crime was to support books that pointed the finger at the mafia as the plotters of the Kennedy assassination. This went on for several years. And one of the books came out at the very time that my book came out. It was called Ultimate Sacrifice.
Oh,
And this book which is proven lies. The false evidence that Juan Almeida was going to plotting against Castro. My God, he was on his way to Algeria at the time, and whatnot. But anyway, and Malcolm Blunt, who compiled a file of all the false statements in that Ultimate Sacrifice book. But that book came out in the minute that my book came out. Well, why is that? Now, as the years passed, another one was Mafia Kingfish by John Davis.
yes.
Another. So then, after the years pass, now the Mafia view is beginning to weaken. People are not believing it as much. Suddenly, then, guess what? We have another false sponsor. And the false sponsor that took the place of the Mafia as throwing smoke on who was involved in the Kennedy assassination was Lyndon Johnson. So I see
Right.
those books about Johnson and his lawyer and his allies creating the assassination as the successor to the Mafia Did It books.
You know what? I absolutely agree with you. It's a perfect way to deflect and to give people another sort of reasonable boogeyman to point the finger at, as opposed to where the trail of evidence actually leads. And to say something about that, though, the only way that I sort of excuse those who start to sucker themselves into the mob thing is that there was a point in time at which we do know that look, the Central Intelligence Agency and their operators thereafter, okay, not necessarily the CIA proper, but those who do operate on the ground are perfectly willing to employ any criminal element in any country at any time. Okay, so there may have been guys who were, say, mob involved in things, but it doesn't mean that that's who was really pulling the strings at the end of the bunny trail. Okay, it doesn't work that way. So I mean, I don't know if you disagree with me on that, but I think
I
that that's
agree
just a
with you,
reality.
Chuck. And the proof of that is what you're saying. The proof of that is if we look at the history of CIA and one of their earliest projects, which was called Gladio, which occurred in Italy. I think it was even before the ink on the charter had dried.
Yes.
They were involving themselves in the elections and post-war elections in Italy to make sure that the coalition between the socialists and the communists did not take power. And in order to all their nefarious deeds were directed toward that, murder, mayhem, whatnot, black ops, and they enlisted the mafia in Italy to help them achieve that end. So they were working with the mafia even before the final product of the contract of the CIA contract. Do we want to call it? Was drawn.
Their charter.
Charter.
Yes.
So I think that's proof. And the wonderful article on Operation Gladio in Lou Wolf's magazine, a Covert Action Information Bulletin, which is now no longer in existence, but Lou actually has a set of those. And if anyone is interested to, get in touch with Lou Wolf in Washington, D.C., and talk, because it's one of the great articles on Operation Gladio. And this magazine, over the years, exposed CIA's activities, among them also, of course, Alan Dulles' use of the Galen organization in using them in the Soviet Union. These are the people that were in the working for the Nazis. And after the war, Alan Dulles enlists the Nazi Secret Service to go and represent CIA in Soviet Union.
Right, and nowadays, I mean, we do talk about how Operation Paperclip was utilized to drag all sorts of Nazi agents, as it were, over into our camp post World War II. Look, Werner von Braun wasn't born in Brooklyn. Okay, very simple.
Dulles made it was real policy of Dulles to use those Galen people. And I think there was a FOIA. I don't know if the name means anything to people. Carl Oglesby, who was one of the presidents of SDS in the 1960s, actually initiated this suit, a FOIA request for the papers of the CIA papers involving the Galen organization. And I think that they have been released. And if anyone is interested in doing that research, it's good research to do.
Right, Oglesby is interesting. He actually authored a couple of books that I have read over the years and things like that. But yeah, an interesting guy in and of himself, really, and somebody who was certainly fighting to get, the real information out of our government files very early on, and a guy who, again, I don't necessarily agree with every conclusion the man came up with, but did stellar work regarding that stuff. And dead on.
One of his books was Yankee versus Cowboy, and I think it was showing the movement of power in the United States from Eastern capital to the West, to the defense contractors of Texas, for example. And it's an important idea that when we think about Lyndon Johnson and and Brown and Root and General Dynamics and all these Temco, David Harold Byrd, all of these characters where power begins to reside with people who are the facilitators of war. You could see it, of course, and there was a marvelous article in Ramparts magazine about Building Lyndon Johnson. I think that was a very clever title, because builders represented Herman and George Brown of Brown and Root, who supported Lyndon Johnson from the late 1930s, and then after Herman had died, but they were sold to Halliburton, and they were the big the people who made the most money. Others made money too, but Brown and Root under Halliburton made the most money in Vietnam.
See, and I always bring this up on my show when people talk about, why are you mentioning Vietnam and correlating it to today? Well, if you take a look at Brown and Root having evolved into Halliburton, yeah, you can see how the same game is played. I'm sorry. Again, my politics, but it's a reality. I mean, this is where these things came from, the foundation of a lot of this stuff. And interesting how figures seem to reappear in a lot of these scenarios as well. I mean, a lot of people don't realize that, McCloy, who was, Warren Commissioner McCloy, well, what did he do post World War II Germany? I mean, you know about this, I'm sure, Joan, right?
The High Commissioner, and he figures in my book about Kay Boyle, because, of course, as I said before, she and her husband, who worked for the Foreign Service, were really under great harassment in Germany after when they were accused of being supporters of communism. Now I lost my train of thought. I wanted to mention something else. Oh, I wanted to say this. And when we talk about CIA, we have to also add that they are not an entity unto themselves, that they represent forces in the United States power structure, that they're not operating as CIA per se, that they represent defense contractors, people who profit from war, these are their clients, and CIA represents these people. And the military works for CIA, and I think this is another old issue, but it's worth mentioning, I think, who is really in power. Is it the military or is it CIA? And one of the ways to answer that question is to look at the career of Edward Lansdale.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you do that, you can see that he seems like an Air Force, he seems like a military officer. But when we actually look at him, we can see that he was CIA from start to finish. And the proof of that is that there are documents available where Lansdale wanted to be promoted just before he retired to brigadier general, I think. And he wasn't getting anywhere. The people at the Pentagon didn't want to promote him. And they got a letter then from Allen Dulles. Right. And as a result of that, he got the promotion. So what does that tell us?
Well, see, now I would only contradict you slightly here to say this. Sometimes it's very difficult to tell whether the large corporation is dictating the policies of the CIA or if the CIA is dictating the policies of other corporations. Okay, this is what, it's sort of an intertwined, interrelated, incestuous kind of relationship between the large corporate interests. And I mean, not just military contractors either. I mean, there's plenty of evidence that they were acting on behalf of, like, the sugar companies in the Caribbean. That's an easy example, and so on. You know what I mean? There's a lot of time where it's not really always clear, I would say, who is running who. But it's definitely a back and forth kind of relationship, and that's what it's about. And at the end of it, seems to me as though the military is just becoming the mechanism of whatever that monstrosity is. I'm not sure where the head of the Frankenstein really came from, but that thing is a monstrosity, the military-industrial complex.
Well, the military, as we can see, serves as cover for CIA quite often. But I think you're right about this sugar and all of that. I'm reminded of this book that I wrote about Cuba. And this book offended everyone, I think, because it's critical of CIA, needless to say. It's critical of Allen Dulles. It's critical of Castro. And so, where are my allies? I don't really have any. And so it was really tough to do. And when you look at the CIA behavior in relation to Cuba, what you see is CIA fortifying itself.
Right. And
acting on behalf of itself as an institution. And its own promoting its own I don't know what's the right word, nurturing, getting bigger, getting its own private power, and not interested in overthrowing Castro, not interested in helping Cuban people liberate Cuba back from Castro, but interested only in what's good for CIA.
Right, self-driven evolution. I kind of codify that as, but that's exactly what it is. They're evolving. I know it sounds a little too positive for what's going on there, but that's what they're doing.
Well, the Cubans were, especially I was writing this book about a Cuban named Alberto Fernandez, who was AM Denim #1 in CIA's terms, and he was really horrified at how CIA treated him. He thought that they, and he and also another character in my book, Gustavo de los Reyes, they thought that CIA was on their side. And what they found that was they were not. And one of the things I did in that book, this Gustavo de los Reyes was imprisoned by Castro for 4 years on the Isle of Pines, comes back to the United States, and he wants to write up his experiences in a magazine that you'd think would really accept his views, Reader's Digest. And what he finds out is CIA controls Reader's Digest. And CIA people are sent to tell him what he can print, what he can't print. They censored his article. And they cut out all the references to Allen Dulles, because Gustavo de los Reyes was very critical of Dulles. When he was involved in this cattleman's plot against Castro, he went to Washington and he talked to Dulles, and Dulles asks, "How much money do you want?" And Gustavo de los Reyes, a very rich guy, he said, "I don't want your money. We came here to tell you what we're about to do." And Dulles turns on him because CIA wanted him to take the money. If he didn't take the money, CIA could not control him. Right. So Dulles then says, "Well, you're going to wind up in a cemetery." He says, "I'd rather do that than not be free, and so forth." And what happens is really terrible. And what Dulles did was to inform the Cuban government of the plot. And as a result, Gustavo de los Reyes and all the others were arrested and went to jail. Dulles blew the whistle on them. He was a terrible, terrible man.
Yeah, well, Alan Dulles, as well as his brother John Foster Dulles, again, as I said, really dictated a whole lot of American policy during a large strip of American history. And from the seat of where the State Department in the case of John Foster Dulles, and from the head of the CIA in the case of Alan Dulles, until John F. Kennedy dismissed him.
He never left, though. He might have left physically, but he really was running the show, because in my Haiti book, I show Alan Dulles sending Philippe de Vaujoly, who was from the French clandestine services, on a mission into Cuba to see what missiles were there. This is 1962. Now, Dulles was already out of office as director of Central Intelligence. He's already sending people on assignments to Cuba. So I don't think John McCone wasn't that interested. He was really an industrialist. And I think that Dulles continued as long as he drew breath to run CIA.
Right. I feel the same. And see, that's another sort of aspect to this that I think a lot of people don't understand, is that, I often have to kind of separate when I'm speaking about it, that there is a CIA proper. There is the understanding that the public is allowed to have about the agency. And then there is the community, which doesn't necessarily adhere to all of the rules, regulations, constructs, etc., that the agency proper does. Okay, so Dulles could still exert influence despite having been retired. There are others who exerted influence past the point at which they were supposed to be involved. I mean, this is something that has gone on because it's still kind of an entity. It is kind of an entity unto itself. It's not supposed to be, but it is in a lot of places. And I'm not saying
never accountable. They were never. One of the people who tried to make CIA accountable was Eugene McCarthy in 1968, when he was a senator from Minnesota. Help me out, Minnesota. Eugene McCarthy. When he ran for president in 1968 in the primaries. And he's put out an idea, but no, he didn't get any support in the Senate for the view that they should call the CIA accountable for its actions. There was no support for that at all. We don't have a lot of faith in Congress anymore. But that's just one more example of what's going on.
Oh, right, and I still say that these things continue to resonate to this day. I mean, not just in the example of Brown and Root to Halliburton, but I mean, all of this stuff continues on, and they've actually gotten a lot smarter and decided not to reveal their hands so easily as they once did. And it is interesting. It is interesting, and I think if we really do unravel all this stuff and get the truth out, regarding what really happened, as opposed to what it is we're supposed to believe, as opposed to what it is they drill into our heads. From the mainstream, as it were, I think that this is something that can change. At least I hope so. We only have about, let's see now, we only have like around 10 minutes left. And I wondered if there was anything that we didn't cover. I know we went all over the map, and I hope I didn't make you tired going through all these different subjects. But it's just, I love speaking with you, and I'm happy to kind of share this with the listeners, because I love just speaking to you in general. I mean, just some years back, I remember calling you after Hurricane Sandy, and even just kind of talking to you and just kind of enjoying the conversation, because I'm so happy when I'm not the only one that can hold one of these conversations about the realities of certain aspects of history. Of course.
Well, one thing leads to another. I was telling you when we were talking earlier, that I was one of the things my publisher wanted in this Faustian Bargains book was to discuss the Great Society legislation of Lyndon Johnson. Right. And I remembered, which I hadn't thought of in years. I wrote a book years ago called Privilege, which was a true crime book about the murder or death of the daughter of Ambassador David K.E. Bruce. That was his younger daughter, Sasha. He had an older daughter named Audrey, who was the daughter of Bruce with Elsa Mellen, Mellon, who was the sister of Paul Mellen and the daughter of Andrew Mellen, and very rich, of course. That's where the money came from. And Audrey and David Bruce's daughter with Elsa Mellen, his older daughter Audrey, married a fellow named Stephen Currier, and they created something called the Taconic Foundation, which was a liberal foundation, and among their projects was in Mississippi in the South a voter education project, and it was run by someone called Harold Fleming. And how I interviewed Harold Fleming when I was writing that book. I was wanting to write that book really also about Audrey as well as Sasha. But anyway, I did interview Harold Fleming, and he told me that the Voting Rights Act of Lyndon Johnson was really written by Stephen Currier, and that he just stayed up nights and, banged out that text. And I think one of the things, this is the least pernicious thing about Lyndon Johnson, is that he knew how to draw on very bright young men. As I was saying this before in relation to Mac Wallace and Bill Moyers and all of these, John Connolly is another one, Lloyd Hand is another one, many of these people that Johnson gathers and sort of corrupts, if you like. Having to work for Johnson is a form of corruption. But anyway, there's Stephen Currier sweating out at night writing the text, and of course you don't hear his name. Johnson takes credit for all of these things. I think Hubert Humphrey was annoyed too at the Civil Rights Act, that it was really gotten out of committee by Humphrey and by others, and Johnson acts as if, of course, it's his. Now, as you were saying, Chuck, earlier, I think it's also certainly true that Johnson, as a way of getting the Kennedy people who worked for John F. Kennedy, to stay with him at least until the 1964 election, was to pretend that he was going to put the policies of John F. Kennedy into reality. And that was the way he seduced even so shrewd a figure as Ted Sorensen. That he was, and how could they resist when Johnson is telling them that he's going to make Kennedy's policies into law in a way that Kennedy wasn't able to do. So, of course, one of the policies that he also immediately started on was Vietnam, which was not one of Kennedy's policies. So there's always a half-truth there. But that was he seduced people, Lyndon Johnson did, and that was one of the ways, was to pretend, oh, I'm just nobody, and he was so well educated, and I wasn't educated, and all this business. This false modesty, false obsequiousness. It's really sickening when you look back on it.
Right, and of course, Ted Sorensen, just in brief, there's a lot more to Ted Sorensen than what I'm about to say, but just for those who might not understand, this is the guy who actually wrote a whole lot of the speeches that John F. Kennedy is most well known for. He was somebody who was definitely involved in the overall character of that presidency, I mean, to a degree that I think is still minimized quite a bit in the literature. I don't know, maybe in recent years people have more gotten to that fact, but if you admire the Kennedy presidency, you have to know that Theodore Sorensen contributed to that a great deal. At least, at the very least, the public perceptions were very much shaped by Sorensen. So
I also felt, when I knew him a little bit, him I knew, and I also felt, and I hope history proves me wrong, it was close to the agency. And the idea that CIA was somewhere very far away wasn't really true. And that is, the Kennedy people were right under their noses. And I remember that it's in my book, but Farewell to Justice, I asked one of Garrison's classmates from law school, Wilmer Thomas, to go ask Arthur Schlesinger whom he thought killed President Kennedy. You notice that Schlesinger never said anything, neither did Sorensen in public. And Schlesinger told Wilmer, we were at war with the national security people. He didn't use the word agency. He said we were at war with the national security people. Same thing, though, isn't it? So he's saying, in effect, but he never said it in public. I don't think he ever wrote it. He just said it in conversation. And as far as Sorensen is concerned, I remember that I wrote him a letter, and I asked him, remember that quotation? It was in the New York Times, without a source, and it said, it was quoting John F. Kennedy, and it said, I'm going to tear the CIA into 1,000 pieces Remember that? And cast it to the wind. Cast them to the
Cast
wind.
it to the four winds or something like that.
And
Yeah.
I wrote to Sorensen. I said, "You remember me? We had dinner. Blah blah. What is the source of that quote? Because no one has ever given the source."
Right.
So, and he answered me, and he said, "I never heard of it," which is, of course, that's impossible. So he just covered it up. He's another. He's a
Hmm.
pillar. He was a rep. He worked in the international department of Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. Not It was Lloyd Garrison, the law firm, famous law firm in New York.
No,
And
no relation to Jim Garrison at
no,
all.
no, no. Well, in a certain way. I mean, William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, might have been a common ancestor.
Ah.
But
Okay.
but yeah, but in any case, Ted Sorensen was a pillar of the establishment. And when we talk about, quote, the establishment, we talk about the agency. And so it's so contradictory. These people they were trapped. And I think, President Kennedy was trapped. And Bobby Kennedy was trapped, really trapped. And Bobby Kennedy's solution to all this in the afterwards, as I know I'm not too popular for saying this, but I'm sure it's true, was to cover up everything. Never say a word of truth about what happened in the assassination. And the idea that he would if he got to be president, if he would then tell the truth is ludicrous. It's really ludicrous. So silly. But in any case, no one knows what somebody would have done. But one thing is clear: the Kennedy family had their boot on the truth about the Kennedy assassination. If we look at the Garrison case, I don't know how we can see that. But I'm reminded of it when I would have hoped that Sorensen and Schlesinger, who really loved President Kennedy, I think, would have told the truth and didn't.
Yeah, it is a sad commentary. Is that all these people that were, very very close to him, the so-called Irish mafia and everything else. These guys, they never did come out and really make the statements that they probably could have easily made, because they were there, and they understood what the struggle was. And you and I are only able to really gather a sense of what that struggle was like against the intelligence community, against the establishment. Okay, both things work here. We can only really gather a sense of it, but they could have been, firsthand witnesses, and
They
they failed
were.
to do
They
so.
were.
Well, I'm saying in history's books at this point,
Right.
they could have
Well,
been first
they
witnesses.
maybe they were afraid. I mean, you have to think maybe they were. They knew how dangerous CIA was.
Right. I try to think that of O'Donnell, that he was fearful of what might happen if he actually said something. You know what I mean? But who knows? I never met the man actually, so I don't know. It's just one of those things, and I gotta say that we've only got like a couple of minutes left here, and I really want to thank you once again, for coming on and covering all this ground. And I know we could go on and on about this, but I really think we knocked out a lot of really stellar pieces of information here for anybody who is interested in any of these subjects. And of course, there's a whole lot more that can be explored. And I advise you, if you wish to learn, definitely take a look at the writings of Joan Mellen, and that is spelled, by the way, Mellen, not the On way. Because you did mention before, the melon, the money. No, that's not you. Different name, but same sound.
Well,
So,
I appreciate your having me on, Chuck. I really do. And it's fun to talk and to try to put these ideas out and see where it goes and what's real, what's
exact,
true.
exactly. Because at the end of the day, I mean, that's really what concerns somebody like you. It's kind of irrelevant what people's theories are and all of that kind of stuff. It comes down to, what facts can we lay our hands on, what really provable ideas are there about what has actually gone on. And sometimes, I really do look to you as a really astounding kind of author, because you are really dispassionate about exactly where things fall. if it goes, a way that you thought it was going, it's fine. If it doesn't, it doesn't, because that's where the evidence lies.
Well, that's a good. I want to say that's, of course, I think maybe you're thinking about Mac Wallace now. And I just told the story of Mac Wallace, and I told who he was, what he believed in. Was he a radical? Was he a communist, the way some authors have written? Who exactly was he? And I spent.